Are censorious lefties on Twitter undermining free speech and putting at risk the foundations of a liberal society? Or are wealthy celebrities just annoyed that they are, for once, being held to account for their ill-thought-out and prejudiced opinions by ordinary people online? That's the question, the debate that was sparked by a letter in Harper's magazine this week, signed by, amongst others, Noam Chomsky and J.K. Rowling. It's also what we're going to be debating for the first part of this show. And I am delighted to be joined this Friday because she couldn't make Monday's show. Ash Sarkar.
You tried to cancel me, Michael. You tried to cancel me, tried to keep me off the airwaves. And here I am, like a billionaire children's author, clawing my way back.
You showed it can be done. Maybe Lawrence Fox just needs some more perseverance. I'm also joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing?
Very good. Have I not been cancelled yet? Let me see. Is my GH4 cancelling me? No.
I don't think my lighting's good enough, which maybe is that me getting cancelled?
You were quite dark. I think your lighting cancelled you on Wednesday's show, actually. But you look good now.
We'll get onto that story properly in a moment. Before we do that, share the show link and let us know your thoughts by tweeting on the hashtag TiskiSour. I should also tell you what else is on the show actually tonight. We are going to be talking about whether Keir Starmer is trying to outflank Boris Johnson on the right when it comes to economic policy, why the police are being investigated for racism, and whether a property developer or an artisan pizza restaurant owner is in fact working class. That was a debate prompted by a fairly lazy article in The Guardian this week. But to our first story. So this letter published on Wednesday, it was titled "A Letter on Justice and Open Debate." As I said, it was signed by people such as J.K. Rowling, Noam Chomsky, Margaret Atwood. You had centrist political scientist Yascha Mounk, ex-George W. Bush speechwriter David Frum. I think there are about 150 people signed it. We can go to, I suppose, some of the key parts of that letter. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we'll go to the most important bits. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. It goes on. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy, but resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. And finally, let's go to this bit as well. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter-speech from all quarters, but it's now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgression of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panic damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. What do you guys make of this letter? If you want your sort of open letter to have impact, it certainly had it. It's been, commented on in most of the major websites and publications throughout the United States and the UK, but also it's had mega pushback. I'll go to you, Ash, first.
I mean, so the text of the letter itself is sort of so vague and euphemistic as to be impossible to disagree with. I think all of us agree that it's important to have a shared arena in which political contestation can take place, in which people are free to articulate ideas, express themselves, and are not worried about, losing their job, losing their home, being arrested. I think all of us agree about that. However, the letter has emerged within a context, and that context is made clear by some of the signatories who, far from being silenced, actually enjoy wealth and platform which is exceptional, right? Especially compared to the rest of society. The idea that J.K. Rowling has been silenced is is completely absurd. And so then it seems that within that context, you have to read the letter text itself through a somewhat skeptical lens. And the question that you have to ask yourself is like, well, what is being cancelled? What is this swift and severe retribution that's being spoken of? So one of the signatories to the letter said that she had her book cancelled. I'm not sure if she was signatory to the letter actually, but she was replying to J.K. Rowling on Twitter saying that she had her book cancelled because of cancel culture. The publishing house replied and said, no, actually, we had to publish your book because you threatened a lawsuit and it's available anywhere. And the cancelling offence that she'd committed in the first place was trying to get a transport worker fired for eating while in her uniform. So it's pretty disingenuous, right? Who gets to call themselves a defender of free speech, who gets to call themselves a victim of intolerance, and why any of this happened in the first place. And so it seems to me that while I think there are problems with social media censoriousness, I think that there are times where the left is unstrategic in how it engages with debate. This is a group of exceptionally wealthy and powerful people who can't take criticism, right? Who can't take the idea of people mobilizing the opposing political interests. And in fact, I would say that is quite a dangerous threat to free expression. It's not a defense of it.
Let's go actually to the part of the letter which, again, quite vaguely sort of goes through what their examples of cancelling are. So it says, editors are fired for running controversial pieces, books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity, journalists are barred from writing on certain topics, professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class, a researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organisations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Aaron, your take?
My take, the hot take. This has always happened. I mean, some of these very same people, I wonder what they make of, for instance, McCarthyism in 1950s America. Now, that's not a great place to start from, or saying, well, this has happened before, therefore it's legitimate. And as Ash has already said, I think it's entirely correct to defend free speech, and you want to build a broad political coalition around it. But I think what really brings this into sort of disrepute is the signatories. David Froome was the gentleman who wrote the acts of evil. He coined the term acts of evil in the State of the Nation address, State of the Union address that George W. Bush delivered, around the time of the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, wants to invade Iran and Syria shortly thereafter. When did this Habermasian sphere of deliberative democracy exist, which they're appealing to, this abstraction which apparently preceded the existence of internet trolls and Twitter? It didn't. And the point is, when these people were in charge, people like David Froome, that they certainly weren't the kind of democratic norms they were appealing to. Let's look at what the Bush administration was doing. They were pushing through, trial without jury. They were pushing through extraordinary rendition. They were pushing through using evidence that had been the consequence of being extracted under torture. They were pushing through, we know, for instance, war crimes. Basically, there was a blind eye turned towards war crimes committed in Iraq, by the Brits as well, by the way, at Camp Stephen. So I really think the whole thing is just completely ridiculous, given those who were signing it. And then, of course, nobody is silencing J.K. Rowling. She's one of the most successful authors in the English-speaking language. And if we want to talk about sort of experts in cancelling, given our relatively, compared to these people, small profiles, Ash, people have tried to cancel Ash and me. So much. People tried to cancel me so much. I try to get my book pulled, try to get my PhD pulled, get job offers pulled, everything, everything you can imagine. But guess what? It's not the worst thing in the world. You get on with it. And it's a slight problem. Yes, it's probably an outgrowth of the kind of technologies we use nowadays to foment public conversations. Often, for instance, on Twitter, that's not particularly healthy. And there are certain affordances which grow out of those technologies. Sure, we can have that debate, but I found the language here a bit too moralizing, and the people making the arguments not particularly authentic.
Can I just add to that very quickly? So I don't actually talk about this that much because at the time it felt quite upsetting. A while ago, I was in a BBC documentary called The Rise of the Nazis, and I was talking about the persecution of German communists, in particular Ernst Thälmann, And I was supposed to speak to it, obviously, from a communist perspective and try and put myself in the shoes of someone who didn't know just how terrible things were going to get and kind of explain that way of thinking. And when it was announced that I was going to be in this documentary, there was uproar from Tracy Ann Oberman and Rachel Riley. And the Board of Deputies released a statement saying how inappropriate and awful it was. And essentially saying that, you know, as an anti-Semite, I can't talk about anything to do with the Holocaust. Of course, wasn't talking about the Holocaust. I was talking about the treatment of communists. Now, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is because while that was deeply painful and I rejected the accusation of anti-Semitism wholeheartedly, it's actually completely legitimate free expression for those figures, including Tracy Ann Oberman, including the Board of Deputies, including historian Simon Sharma, to say that they didn't think that I should have appeared in this documentary. Even though I felt it was deeply unfair, they have the right to say that. And they also had the right to, you know, organise and to try and apply pressure to the BBC to, you know, drop me from the documentary or edit me out and so on and so forth. And that's the thing, is that when you enter public debate of some kind, you're not always going to be treated fairly. It would be nice if everyone was treated fairly, but that's not going to happen all the time. And what you've got to ask yourself is if the measures that you're going to bring into being so that you can ensure that you're treated more fairly, are they actually going to cultivate more freedom of expression or in fact restrict it? Had I decided to go, you know, balls to the wall and say, I'm going to litigate because this is, you know, defamation of my character, I think that would have been really wrong. It would have been the wrong thing to do, because I do think that racial minorities have the right to call people racist or anti-Semitic or whatever it is, even if it's not fair and even if it's not accurate.
I think that's an important point. I want to go to a tweet from Philippa Sue. So she was an actor in Hamilton, and because I suppose in a way one of the reasons this letter sparked a debate is because, you know, lots of people thought, well, lots of people were pissed off at the signatories. Other people thought this was an incredibly important thing to say. But then also some people said the responses to it were demonstrative of the problem it was talking about. So on the one hand, I think the most attention really went to a Vox journalist who was herself trans, who said that Matt Iglesias, who's another Vox journalist who signed it, said that sort of him signing this letter, which the contents of which are kind of anodyne, sort of was a dog whistle that made her feel less safe in, you know, the workplace. Which some people thought was a bit of an overreaction. But there was also this one I want to go to. So it's graphic 9. Cancel culture. If you are cancelled but do not wish to be, you must work to earn back people's respect by owning up to the thing that cancelled you in the first place, listening to others, educating yourself, and advocating on behalf of the people that you have offended, harmed. And that's got 30k retweets and 190k likes. So clearly this is sort of putting forward an opinion, a stance, which has some traction among, I mean, presumably progressive circles on social media. And I do think that, you know, that rings true in a way. So I totally agree with both of your points, that this idea that this is something that comes from the left and is a sort of unique threat to free speech is getting everything completely out of proportion. Obviously, well, not obviously, but just look at the facts, right? Well, when it comes to who is trying to suppress free speech, who is trying to get people to lose their jobs, who is trying to get people off talk shows, it's mainly people on the right trying to get people on the left cancelled, as that example you gave there, Ash, just sort of demonstrated so powerfully. But I do think you can get on the left, well, you definitely get on the left, a bit of an attitude whereby if you have offended someone, then, or if you have said something which someone disagrees with, they assume that the response is that you need to go and learn more, you need to go and earn back the respect of whoever you have offended, instead of maybe accepting that you might just have a difference of opinion. And I do think that whilst that isn't a threat to civilization, it can make progressive circles and left politics much weaker and a much less welcoming space and a much less critical space than it really should be. Am I being unfair? Aaron?
Well, I just want to quickly pick up on, I don't think you're being unfair. I want to quickly pick up on what Ash said about minorities have the right to call people racist. Absolutely. But in the ideal society, A, you would take those points very seriously, and B, they would have huge consequences for the people who were alleged to be racist. And so it shouldn't be done lightly, whoever is making that claim. And clearly these things are being said by people in those circles, and I've been subject to that as much as, if not more than Ash, probably the same. Certainly not in that episode was just incredibly intense. It was horrific to watch. I don't think that people should have, whatever their background or race, should have carte blanche. I still think you have to have just cause in calling somebody racist. You can't say, well, you don't need just cause because of the color of your skin. I don't necessarily. I think there's a calculus that still needs to exist. And I think that you can say that, you can navigate that, Ash, because you're very likable. You're very intelligent, right? I know that you can say, well, on balance, I think, on balance, I reckon, most people will know that I'm not this, and the ones that might think that, I can demonstrate that that's not accurate, right? You back yourself because you're very smart, you're very likable. But just because somebody's not as likable as you are, it doesn't mean that they should be tarnished as a racist, right? Or just because they're not as emotionally intelligent as you are, that they deserve that label. And I do think that I believe in freedom. When people say, Aaron, you're an anti-Semite or you're a racist, I go, you know what? It's a free country. You're allowed your opinion. But when people are actually trying to obstruct somebody going on television, talking about history which they're very well acquainted with, they haven't got a criminal record in regards to these things. I think it's a really big problem. When I talk about Julia Hartley-Brewer or the right on the BBC, I don't want them not going on there. They represent a certain substrate of public opinion in this country. All I ever say is, can you also please do the same for people on the left? Yeah, it's true. Nigel Farage does represent 15% of 20% of the country on issues like migration, issues like integration with the European Union, various intergovernmental organizations. I get that. The point is, the other side of the coin was rarely, if ever, represented. And so I do think there's a big conversation there. And actually, I want to build on what you said, Michael, just before. I don't want to say there's no problem here. Let's just dismiss it out of hand. I do think a very pernicious, unhealthy culture has emerged, actually within the left as much as anywhere else. And I do think it's interesting now that 5-6 years ago, we were having these conversations on the left, and now it's all of a sudden, it's a conversation that people are having in broader popular culture. Now, I think to an extent it's been hijacked and instrumentalized by the right. Absolutely. That doesn't mean there's not a kernel of truth to it. And I think, again, I would say, little old technological determinist me, I think a significant amount of that comes from two things. First, the absence, really, of democratic, deliberative conversations in Western culture for the last 30, 40 years. It's like when you see forward momentum and momentum renewal, they're always arguing, no, that's democracy. That's what you do. You contest within a set of rules, you make your case, and may the best person win. That's literally how democracy works. And people are so unacquainted with the practice of democracy. Now that's something to be laughed at and scorned and derided. Secondly, when you have that absence of a democratic political culture, which is the result really of 40 years of neoliberalism, conjoined to often toxic technologies, things like Twitter, for instance, not just Twitter, the digital culture more generally, which can be hugely informative and emancipatory, but also comes at huge significant costs, often very corrosive in terms of fostering a healthy public debate. Those two things come together. You then chuck that onto a political economic context, which we are all in agreement on in terms of the more general polarization of politics, and it looks like a dumpster fire. So, I do think we need a really coherent, well-intentioned conversation around freedom of speech. I think it's hugely important. I just think the last people we should be listening to on this are people from the right.
I want to look at people losing their jobs. Because one of the things.
Oh, wait. Could I very quickly come in on what you said previously? Otherwise, I was going to complain that my freedom of speech was being oppressed. But I just wanted to come back on this point that you raised about that tweet from Philippa Sue, which is what you have to do if you've been cancelled is listen, take accountability, da 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 da. I think one thing that's missing from this conversation is that this is such an American concept. It's so earnest and rigid and unforgiving at the same time. It's like walking into I don't know, a Montessori school and you're talking to the school therapist and they've also got an Uzi. Do you know what I mean? It's this kind of strange American, affected sincerity. And I think that it's part of how political ideas grow, and they grow in tandem with various kinds of interpersonal norms and subcultures. So I think when you're kind of at the beginning of working some of these things out, you become very, very rigid and uncompromising. And I know that, you know, when I was at uni, I had my like little campus totalitarian phase where I just kept pointing at things and going, that's problematic, no platform. Because when all you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. And I think what happens as not just personal growth happens, but also I think political growth happens. So you're having to work with, you know, a mass movement. You want to achieve, you know, structural and lasting political change. And it means that you've got to deal with the imperfection of people. I think you become a little less strident about some of these things. That doesn't mean that you don't take political values seriously. It doesn't mean that you don't take racism seriously, transphobia or ableism, but it just means you're able to accommodate a bit more, and you're able to entertain the notion that maybe you're not the arbiter of like morality or wisdom. So that's one of the things that I kind of want to say when we kind of pull up these tweets, is just like at what stage in their political journey is this person? Because I read something like that and I think it just comes across as kind of like, not to be rude, but a bit immature. Except it's, you know, now got like, you know, 30,000 retweets and it's seen as symbolic of something because it's on social media and they've got a blue tick.
No, I mean, I totally agree with that. And the bit I like actually in what you just said is you shouldn't assume that you have a monopoly on like wisdom, right? Because I think there is, you know, sometimes the way people sort of put forward this idea of like, oh, I've got a nuanced position, is that the reason I don't like cancel culture is because people can change. Whereas I think actually it is a bit more fundamental than that. The reason you shouldn't just, you know, dismiss other people's opinions as, you know, beyond the pale isn't because they might come around to a different opinion. It's because you might be wrong, right? You can't always assume that any disagreement is because of bad faith on the other side or because someone really just wants to protect their own privileges, which, I mean, can be something that people fall back on. We're going to rush through super quickly on people losing their jobs because this is, you know, what comes up a lot on Twitter and in this letter. They're talking about this has real world consequences. It's not just people being annoying in their mentions, which is sort of the deflationary way of talking about this problem. I think it partly is a lot about people being annoying in their mentions. So one of the people that people think is widely referred to in that letter is someone who I think did lose his job and shouldn't have done. And then we're going to go on to someone who did and definitely should have done. So David Shaw has been talked about a lot recently. He shared research by Omar Wassal, so that argued violent protests can be self-defeating in the long run. If you watch the debate me and Aaron had on about riots, we used this research, peer-reviewed, very, you know, I think it's pretty good. But on Twitter, he got sort of called out as saying this is leaning into anti-Black racism at a time of Black Lives Matter. Why, you know, who are you to sort of bring this up? He got attacked on Twitter and then lost his job at a progressive political consultancy firm. So a complete overreaction on the part of his employers. No one has confirmed whether or not that was precisely the reason, but he has a non-disclosure agreement and no one's denied it. It's all a very bizarre situation, but it does seem like a case of overreach, you know, where this has gone wrong. But the one that often gets brought up in the UK is Noah Carl. He's a sociologist who was offered a position at Cambridge College, but that position was then rescinded after a backlash from academics. I want to go and have a look at some of the coverage that this case got. So that's Noah Carl there. And we can see people like Matt Goodwin have really been defending this guy. So there's a Times piece here. Mob rule is crushing free speech on campus. Debate is being shut down in our universities by a stifling new orthodoxy, a liberalism. Now a young sociologist sacked by his Cambridge colleges fighting back with a lawsuit. And we can go to Munira Mirza, who sort of goes with a very similar line when it comes to, she's writing specifically again about Noah Carl. Intolerant zealots are strangling the intellectual freedom of our universities. And so you could look at this and you say, look, this was someone who was offered a job. Then academics sort of said, oh, we don't like what he's researching, and then he gets fired. And that's the story that these two people, who are quite influential, especially Munira Mirza, are telling people. You know, it's just a case of people said, I don't like his research, the college freaked out, he's fired. But if you look deeper into it, there was due process took place. The guy was fired and he 100% should have been. So I want to go through some of the facts of the matter. So before being given the job, Carl was a postgraduate working at Oxford, and he published loads and loads of papers on this open source platform called OpenPsych. So it doesn't require peer review, and it's occupied by a lot of people on the right because you can put shoddy research on there because it doesn't need to be peer reviewed. You review it each other depending on what, other bloggers on the website review it. And he would talk about very controversial topics on there. So we wrote a piece arguing that racist stereotypes are reasonably accurate. Another one about sort of connecting the size of Muslim populations to rates of terrorism. One of the references there was to the religionofpeace.com, which is an Islamophobic conspiracy website cited 4 times in the manifesto of Anders Breivik. And then if you look deeper into this, you can say there was due process. There was a panel that was put together by the college to take account or to assess the criticisms that had been made of this guy's work. And the conclusion, is pretty solid. So let's look at the justification for them firing him. So the panel found that Dr. Karl had put a body of work into the public domain that did not comply with established criteria for research ethics and integrity. In any event, it considered that the poor scholarship of this problematic body of Dr. Karl's work, among other things, meant that it fell outside any protection that might otherwise be claimed for academic freedom of speech. Furthermore, the panel found that in the course of pursuing his problematic work, Dr. Karl had collaborated with a number of individuals who were known to hold extremist views. There was a serious risk that Dr. Karl's appointment could lead directly or indirectly to the college being used as a platform to promote views that could incite racial or religious hatred and bring the college into disrepute. So you've got there an example of someone who, yes, did lose a job because of an outcry, but it was also, the right thing to do. And that's not just because I disagree with the guy. That's because he's publishing pseudoscience, and much of what he had published ended up on far-right blogs saying Oxford academic this, Oxford academic that. And it's perfectly reasonable for that college not to want to give the legitimacy that comes with a job there to a guy who, who is completely irresponsible with the sociology he publishes. Actually, before I go to you two, I want to just go now to one more exchange that I thought was instructive on Twitter today. So Andrew Neil accused Owen Jones of cancelling him. We can get up this tweet. So Andrew Neil says, he tried and failed to cancel my BBC career several times. And this is Andrew Neil basically saying, he tried to get rid of he tried to help me lose my job, but he failed. But what's he actually referring to? So we can see a Guardian article here which pointed out, so can we get this up? So Owen Jones in this article is saying, Andrew Neil has lots of connections to the right, but also I'm not calling for him to lose his job. I'm just saying it tells us something about the BBC that someone who edits, or who's the chairman of, my apologies, a right-wing magazine can have the most prominent politics interviewer role. And if that were to be on the left, it would never be seen as legitimate. And you can kind of see that because Lewis Goodall hired Newsnight hired Lewis Goodall, who's a bit on the left, but not particularly, not to the extent that Andrew Neil is on the right, and now the government boycotting the show. I also want to go to this clip, which is, the exchange that Andrew Neil points to as Owen Jones being completely unreasonable. Take a look at this and see who was cancelling who.
Almost run out of time, so I want to ask you another question. Well, I'm many things, Owen Jones, but I'm not naive.
You are. Well, no, can we just say The Spectator is a classic example?
Yeah, I knew you were going to bring that up, and I won't let you hijack that.
No, it's not about hijacking, it's about The Spectator.
Your smears and lies about me are not going to be dealt with tonight, so just move off it.
We're going to talk about the media.
I'm not going to let you hijack the BBC to do this. It's got nothing to do with it. What I want to ask you is this. When the far right behaves appallingly, that's thuggery. But when the far left does it, that's activism. I don't understand the difference.
No, I will finish what I was going to say about Spectator.
No, you won't.
Well, you will.
Because it's not right for you to take the BBC
that
to do
magazine
something
has
that
defended,
has got nothing to do with the BBC.
It has defended Greek neo-Nazis.
No, it
has published an article. Yes, it has. Everyone.
And by the way, the editor is responsible.
In defence of the Wehrmacht. You're
why
the
don't you answer my question?
You're the chairman of The Spectator.
I'm not responsible for the content. Answer my question.
There wasn't enough Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. That's what we're dealing with in The Spectator, like other newspapers.
All right.
Now, in terms of left-wing activism,
you've run out of time, so you can't answer the question. So there you go. So maybe
everyone can look at the record of The Spectator.
Everybody can look at the record.
Incited racism against
Muslims, and you and I may return to this, but not on another forum. Tonight was not the night to deal with your lies and smears about me. So let's leave it and we move on. Owen Jones, thank you very much.
Okay.
So who there was scared of the debate about the facts? It didn't seem to be Owen Jones. It seemed to be Andrew Neil. And whilst Andrew Neil there was trying to say it's completely irrelevant to the discussion we're having, the discussion they were having was about Owen being attacked by far-right thugs in Parliament Square. Owen was making a connection between the far right and the kind of far-right articles that are published in the magazine which Andrew Neil is chair of. He decided he didn't want to talk about this, and so he shut him down. And now Andrew Neil is using his, fights with Owen Jones as an example of cancel culture on the part of Owen Jones. Ash.
I mean, Owen Jones has done more than bacon fat to raise the blood pressure of, boomer journalists. I mean, it is astonishing the way he gets under the skin of some of the highest paid journalists in the land. Like, that's clout I could only dream of. And I think the reason why he winds people up so much is because he's quite happy to break the omerta of the media. The media loves its own sort of social rules. It's kind of like, a private school in that way, where they're all horrible to each other, but they're not going to accept being criticized by someone who's an outsider. That's just not the done thing. Owen comes along and he's, clearly, a partisan, like we are, and like I would argue many journalists are, and he comes from the wrong bit of politics, right? He doesn't have the pedigree. He's come from, an activist left-wing background, both his parents were part of militant, that kind of thing. And he's unapologetic about it. He didn't try and, disguise himself as a Blairite or a Brownite or a Milibandite to make these things more palatable. And then he criticizes the media. There are absolutely gaping hypocrisies in the media. So one example is BBC impartiality. So you have chairman, very right-wing magazine, it's legitimate to have a very right-wing magazine, who is the BBC's lead interviewer. You've got other huge hypocrisies in terms of racism, in terms of, people saying horrendous things, and it's often hosts as well, and not being pulled up on it. And yet they'll criticize others, in particular politicians or, other activists for being, racially insensitive. You've got the hypocrisy around class. You've got the hypocrisy around drug use being a huge one. And the idea is that you never bring it up in front of the host, not the done thing, right? If you're on a panel, you fight each other, you don't fight the host. And that's why they hate Owen so much. And it's hard work to try and reimpose discipline on that kind of setting, especially when it makes Andrew Neil, who is one of the most ferocious and I think methodical interviewers there is, it makes him look out of control. So the only way he's been able to reassert himself, because he didn't have any answers for Owen, right? That's the fact of it. He just simply didn't have any answers, is to say, this is someone who wants to suppress my free speech, rather than actually engage in a legitimate discussion. It might be a heated discussion. It might be one where you think someone's completely out of line for even bringing it up, but it is a legitimate discussion.
Aaron, your final thoughts on this topic before we move on to Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson?
Well, it's just pathetic. I mean, I would implore our audience to Google a gentleman's name, Mordechai Vanunu. He was the guy who was the source of the Sunday Times when Andrew Neil was there in the 1980s. He basically told the world about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Very shortly after that was revealed to the Sunday Times team, he was kidnapped by Mossad. He was in prison, I think, for 18 years. He's not been able to leave Israel for 15 years. His life has been turned upside down, and he was incredibly critical of the Sunday Times, not really caring about his security. Or the 4,000 print workers at Wapping, who, when Andrew Neil was, again, editor at the Sunday Times, he was one of a select handful of people who knew about the secret plans to move to Wapping, to move away from Fleet Street, to trick these print workers into not really realizing they would lose their jobs before it was too late. We're talking about people whose lives have been turned upside down. And Andrew Neil thinks that because Owen Jones came on his show and told him facts for about 90 seconds, he's a victim. I mean, that tells you the extent to which people like Andrew Neil on the right, Andrew Neil said that he was the right about Margaret Thatcher when he was at The Economist and the Sunday Times in the late 70s, early 80s. It tells you so much how they've been inoculated from actual criticism that this would upset him to this extent when he has foisted infinitely worse on so many people. It's just delusional. I wonder if he wrote that tweet from his apartment in Trump Tower.
Does he have an apartment in Trump Tower?
He does.
Wow. Len S. Grinder tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour. Isn't this cancel culture letter a typically suppressed middle-class humph for not ignoring your racist uncle's remarks and thereby showing him up to be the racist pig that he is and the disgusting lives that everyone around the table lives? It's a very flowery way of putting it. I like that. We're going to move on to our next story in one moment. First of all, share the show link. Give us a like. It helps us with the algorithm. On Wednesday, Rishi Sunak delivered his mini budget, and with many large and popular spending announcements made, Labour have been struggling to find a clear angle from which to respond. However, their focus became clearer yesterday when Keir Starmer, in an interview with ITV, lasered in on Sunak's job retention bonus, which would give employers, my apologies, £1,000 grant for every worker brought back to work from the furlough scheme. Let's take a look at Starmer's response.
Our concern is that the action they've taken isn't focused on the right places. So the jobs retention bonus is a bonus for all jobs. And many of those jobs, many of the people would have been brought back in any event. Some are really at risk of losing their jobs. So we say it should be targeted in the areas that most need it, not across the piece. And the Chancellor's admitted there's a dead weight in his package. We can't afford dead weights. We need the money to go where it's absolutely needed most, and that's those jobs that won't be retained if the government doesn't support.
So sort of two things to say there. I mean, the instant reaction from watching that, which was mine, and I still maintain it basically, is that for the Labour leader to be coming out and saying we can't afford this policy at this point in time is ridiculous, because there's going to be a push from some quarters to say what we need now is austerity to get down the debt pile that we've built up over the coronavirus crisis. And, you know, we shouldn't be pushing that. Boris Johnson has already said, you know, don't really worry about what we can and cannot afford. We should spend what money needs to be spent. We're not going to do austerity after this crisis. There obviously that created space for the Labour Party, if they wanted to come in here and say, oh, actually, maybe you're spending too much money on these things and we can't afford them. But to do so is catastrophic. All you're doing is shifting the over to window to the right when it comes to economic policy. I also don't know if sort of pitching yourself against employment policies is a particularly electorally sensible thing to do. The counter, though, is to say that this policy, which Rishi Sunak has put forward, is basically just a corporate bailout. It's giving £1,000 to all firms to bring back a worker, whether or not they need them. Which is, you know, a handout from governments to corporations, which isn't going to have that much effect because £1,000 isn't really enough money to sort of encourage you to bring back someone if you weren't going to anyway. But you do get it if you were going to bring them back anyway, if you see what I mean. That's why it kind of is. There is some dead weight loss there, but the argument that we can't afford that seems to be coming at it from completely the wrong angle. Ash.
I mean, so look, I agree with you. I think that this money is a corporate bailout, and it's also too small to make any difference to a firm which is genuinely struggling to bring back workers of furlough, but it's just enough to represent a pretty big transfer of public money into private hands. But the problem for Keir Starmer, I think, is slightly different from the one that you identified, because I don't actually think the issue was, is he or is he not speaking within an austerity frame? The issue for me is that it's kind of emblematic of the interventions that he makes when he's not certain of winning the cause. When he's certain of winning the cause, for example, with NHS visa surcharges or, you know, Marcus Rashford's free school meals over the summer campaign, he sort of sees, you know, the moment in which he enters the fray is kind of the thing which tips it over the edge, but it's likely that that cause was going to be successful anyway. But the rest of the time, it seems to be this very technical finicking without a real sense of what it is Labour would do differently. There's not an alternative vision. There's not an alternative strategy. And what it means is that you kind of get the sense of he's playing for airtime, not saying anything that much, and just sort of hoping to, you know, follow the, you know, direction of travel in terms of his own poll ratings without necessarily alienating anyone or particularly persuading them either. And I think that there's a danger with that. All right. So yes, there are, you know, the particular benefits for him, which is just, you know, stand there, look prime ministerial and reassure people that it's not scary Jeremy Corbyn, right? And that's doing very well for him. Let's be clear. But the downside of that is while you may be sort of winning over these totems of, you know, aggrieved, reactionary English homeowners like, you know, Jeremy Clarkson, Piers Morgan, that's not necessarily a sign that those voters who you lost in the North and the Midlands are going to come back. And while you sort of speak in a right-wing frame, or you just try not to alienate people too much by being too assertive, you've got a political environment which becomes less hospitable for left-wing political causes. And that's going to be a problem that he comes up against, which is that at some point between now and 2024, he's going to have to try and change people's minds about something. So far, he's simply not done that.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron, what's your take? I mean, going into the 2024 general election with a slogan, less deadweight loss, I don't think is going to be particularly inspiring.
I think it was really, really bad. I think when Jeremy Corbyn, or even when any sort of effective left politician is at their best, they get an issue and they polarize it and they try to get a majority of public opinion on their side. You know, the right does that extraordinarily well very often. Brexit was the classic example. One example where Labour did this with Jeremy Corbyn very frequently was free school meals, NHS parking charges. They would get a great policy, really popular policy, which wouldn't cost very much, and say, we're going to make this intervention and we're going to get paid for by taxing rich people. And it's not a huge amount of money. And that was fantastic. It worked really well in 2017. And I don't know why, for instance, Keir Starmer hasn't said more about the fact that NHS staff will have to pay to use hospital car parks. And at the same time, we're spending £900,000 to give the Prime Minister's airplane a paint job. That's the kind of thing that really resonates with people. And it tells them and it demonstrates that the Conservatives are an utterly craven political party when it comes to power, when it comes to status, and they really don't have much time for helping out ordinary people. Similarly with, you know, people, graduates who are junior doctors right now, or who are nurses who are entering the NHS, clearly it would be incredibly popular to talk about debt cancellation for these young people entering our health service. We need to do that, by the way, because so many junior doctors, so many nurses don't stick around for very long because it's not a particularly rewarding career financially. So I just don't know why these are being missed. And the thing about, you know, the deadweight comment, I thought it was a strange word to use. Yes, it's a stupid policy. It really won't work. But it's also quite a nebulous policy. You know, it may work. And at the end of the day, 9 billion in the broader context of running a £300 billion deficit is really small. It's not going to be universally taken up. Let's say 1 million employers take it up. Okay, it's £1 billion, you know? So I don't really, it doesn't really strike me as a particularly important political intervention. And as Asha said, I don't really see how it ties into a broader vision of how Labour would do things differently. You know, I'm not getting passion with Keir Starmer. That's the big worry. And somebody said in the comments before I came back in, it's dishy-rishy versus wishy-washy. And I think that's got to
really good.
I think that's got to be the concern. You know, I'm seeing people take the, you know, that stupid, highly insulated mug that keeps the coffee warm and right. Actually, that would work for me because I often leave a. I drink really slowly with hot drinks, but whatever, that's a separate thing. And people are saying, oh, this is ridiculous. You know what? There's a big chunk of the electorate out there that wants a handsome, well-educated, rich guy with a really high-tech bit of kit, drinking his coffee or tea and looking super competent. That's what they want the Chancellor of the Exchequer to look like. And with Keir Starmer, we were told, by the way, by the Labour right for 4 or 5 months, for 5 years with Jeremy Corbyn, this is what you have to do. And when the Tories start doing, they say, this is ridiculous. How could you? You know, so I don't quite know what Keir Starmer's pitch is. Is it this kind of effective, slick, technocratic operator? Or is it somebody who wants to make a big, decisive change to how we do things in this country? Because I think ultimately the British public is very deferential. I do think that. We live in a democratic society, but we also live in a very hierarchical society. And I think that people look to government in a way that you don't often see in other European countries. Now, they either look at it as something to defer to. These are the people in charge. You have to listen to them. Or they look at it as something which can decisively change society. Clement Attlee, Margaret Thatcher, maybe even Tony Blair. And I don't quite get where Keir Starmer situates himself within that. He's not coming across as a charismatic person who wants to take this by the scruff of the neck. He's not coming across actually as a more understated technocrat who'll adjust things either. I don't quite know what he wants. And perhaps more concerningly, because we're 4 years away from a general election, I don't think he knows how he wishes to present himself.
I'd say as an understated technocrat, he's probably doing okay. But in terms of, I think there are policy implications here to what they've said. It's not just about sort of the impression you give, because dead weight loss, it doesn't mean much to most people. But
a technocrat doesn't say that precisely. I just want to say, yeah, in that context, it's not particularly technocratic intervention.
Well, also, the reason technocrats sometimes talk about dead weight loss. So if you're not familiar with the concept, the idea is that you've paid someone to do something that would have happened anyway. So the idea here is you're paying companies £1,000 to re-employ someone when they would have re-employed them even without the £1,000. But it's a concept which can be used for quite regressive ends. So it's an argument that can be used against universalism, for example. So free education. Many people will get free education who would have paid for university. So there's a bit of dead weight there. Many people would have, paid for an operation if there weren't the NHS there. So that's dead. The government didn't need to pay for it. It would have happened anyway. And you can frame that as a waste of money. I don't think we should. But if the Labour Party are going to go down this route where they say, well, we should only target money where it's absolutely necessary, then we're going to be looking at, something even worse than 2015. We're going to go on to our next story. Before we do that, though, please, if you are enjoying the show, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you get informed every time we go live. It has been announced that the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, will use its formal powers to investigate whether police in England and Wales discriminate against ethnic minorities in their use of force and stop and search. So for context, we can get some stats up as reported by The Guardian, why people feel this investigation is necessary. So several key indicators show police powers in England and Wales are used disproportionately against Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. Stop and search is 9 times more likely to be used against Black people, and taser use almost 8 times more likely. Police deny that ongoing racial bias is the reason. And the IOPC inquiry could be one of the most significant examinations of police and race since the Macpherson inquiry in 1999 found the police to be institutionally racist. I suppose that final sentence there, rather optimistic. We don't know how significant it will turn out to be at this point in time. But some really shocking statistics did come out this week in terms of especially stop and search. I want to go to, again, this is from a different article in The Guardian, which informed us. Young Black men were stopped and searched by police more than 20,000 times in London during the coronavirus lockdown, the equivalent of more than a quarter of all Black 15 to 24-year-olds in the capital. More than 80% of the 29,950 searches between March and May resulted in no further action, according to analysis by the Office of the Home Affairs Select Committee Chair Yvette Cooper. The figures equate to 30% of all young Black males in London, though some individuals may have been searched more than once. Now, this is phenomenal, right? The equivalent of 30% of all young Black males in London were stopped and searched just during the lockdown. Like, that's insane. So the equivalent of 30%, as I said, some people might have been stopped more than once, but that doesn't make it any better. Like, this is, whoa. Can we go to I think we can go to a video of one of these, because I think particularly because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and people have been talking about, discriminatory policing much more than they would have been. And so we're seeing more videos being widely shared of police behaving in what seems like a discriminatory manner, particularly towards young Black men. Now, I hadn't realized that, in my head, I wasn't sure if this was because it was happening more or because it's now just more visible. But these stats do make it seem like this is incredibly widespread. Let's look at this video. It's filmed by Rylan Colasso. I should have checked his name before we went live. He's a blogger and was recently on his way back from an interview with Channel 4 about stop and search after he was stopped and searched a few days before. This is what happened.
When we were speaking to you, you've been in and around your waistband. What are you trying to fiddle with?
I'm with my camera. Okay, so you've blocked the road as well. I'm not dashing anything to my waistband.
You're detained at this moment, okay? Section the Misuse of Drugs Act.
I need to be told. I'm not going to be handcuffed. No, listen to me. No, listen. I've never done drugs in my life.
Class A and Class B.
Why does this keep happening? This can't keep happening to me, man. I'm getting scared. I don't know what's going to happen to me if I come out of the vehicle. I haven't got a problem coming out the car. I just want to make sure I'm not handcuffed. Can't go anywhere.
Fair enough.
I'm out, man. I can't move.
Look at me.
You just smashed my vehicle.
Relax.
Can you be careful, man?
Please video this. I haven't done anything.
Yeah, things recording this. Did you get on camera when we hauled him out?
So that was on May the 29th, and the first incident was on May the 23rd, where police, according to Colasso, aggressively tailgated him and put him in handcuffs as they thought they could smell cannabis in his car. So many of the justifications seem to be that the police can smell cannabis. Ash, I'll go to you first because I know you put out a great video about this week. From your perspective, is this happening more now, or is it just that it's being noticed more now, particularly because of the Black Lives Matter protests?
Well, it's not just from my perspective. The stats show that instances of stop and search for drugs actually went up during the lockdown, which seems completely counterintuitive. You'd expect there to be fewer searches because fewer people are out and about, fewer police officers on the street, we would imagine. Actually, no, stop and searches went up. So it might be the case that the policing powers which were granted to deal with and enforce the lockdown actually provided a pretext to harass young Black men, particularly in London, and place them under suspicion of drugs. And it is very much suspicion of drugs, by the way, because whenever I bring up stop and search, immediately people start talking about knife crime and gun crime. Now, that would mean that you would think that the majority of searches are looking for offensive weapons. That's just not the case. 60% of stop and searches are for drugs. And they usually end up finding very small quantities. Often, as you said, the smell of cannabis is given as a reason, but the data suggests that when police give smell of cannabis given as a reason for conducting a drug search, they're actually far less likely to find cannabis than if they invoke another reason, usually something to do with behavior. And so it's actually a very, very weak grounds. The average weight of a cannabis seizure from a stop and search is between 1 and 5 grams, which is about enough to cope with like particularly persistent period pains, but other than that, it doesn't really do that much to you. So we're talking about possessions which are consistent with personal use, right? That's not Pablo Escobar, that's not Stringer Bell, that's not El Chapo. And as you saw with Ryan Colasso, it's not simply that Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched. They are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs. They're also more likely to have more aggressive and violent forms of policing. So you saw that escalation there, the smashed in window. It's something which could have been dealt with really easily with a conversation. You reassure the gentleman that he's not going to be handcuffed and you take the conversation from there. Police didn't do that. It's also pretty obvious that the only reason why he was stopped in that occasion was because he was a Black man. Well, again, the stats show that the find rate for drug searches on Black people tend to be lower than it is for white people. So it means that you've got more flimsy grounds. And one of the things that I talk about in the video is you can have 2 ways of responding to this. One is tinker around the edges, and the other is to just completely reform how the criminal justice system works. The tinker around the edges solution would say, well, you need to train police officers more. You need to have, perhaps race-blind sentencing recommendations, and perhaps you need to overall reduce the numbers of stop and search at, kind of absolute level. Now, the reduction of stop and search use did happen under Theresa May, but you don't have a proportionate reduction in the disproportionality between Black and white rates of stop and search. When it comes to race-blind sentencing recommendations, it doesn't take into account things like if you've been criminalized from a very young age, well, you're more likely to have more charges anyway, which will result in a harsher sentence. So for me, the response has got to be the full legalization and regulation of psychoactive substances, because the way in which Black people and Asian people are disproportionately criminalized for drugs does not match up with the evidence which tells you something about the various ethnicities and drugs use, right? White people outperform almost every single other ethnic group when it comes to self-reporting use of drugs. So informally, we've got a 2-tiered justice system in which you've got decriminalization of psychoactive substances for some, and you've got over-policing, surveillance, violence, and incarceration for others. I think that one of the problems with, the Lamy report and so on and so forth is that it is just about sort of, twiddling the knobs on the system and hoping for something better. Whereas actually, I think the left needs to be making, in full throat, the demand to legalize and regulate drugs, because you can't reform this kind of unfairness and injustice away.
We are going to go to a tweet now, which shows, I suppose, some more bad news for the Metropolitan Police. This is Lizzie Dearden from the Independent reporting. A serving Metropolitan Police officer, Benjamin Hanan, 21, has been charged with being a member of neo-Nazi terrorist group National Action. He allegedly lied on application and vetting forms, so has been charged with fraud and 2 times possession of illegal images of children. I suppose good that he's been rooted out and fired. We've got no idea how widespread those sorts of far-right ideas may or may not be in the Metropolitan Police. Aaron, your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so I think firstly on the subject matter that Ash was just talking about, did a great interview with a guy called Anthony Lowenstein, who has written one of many books on the war on drugs, and he cites, and it's very frequently cited, vignette now, which is a former advisor to Richard Nixon, says quite openly in the mid-1990s, we saw the war on drugs as a way of tying together the anti-war movement and African Americans, these 2 insurgent voices in American politics from the mid-1960s onwards, and on a daily basis, dismissing them, denigrating them, delegitimizing them to the American public through the prism of drugs, criminality, a dangerous threat to the health of the body politic. And they were very explicit about this. The war on drugs was a political intervention by, the Republican Party under Richard Nixon to set politics back from the immense gains that were being made after the Civil Rights Act, after the anti-war movement against Vietnam, which were, within the context of the mid-1960s, huge, huge disruptive forces to American politics. And to turn that back, you have the war on drugs. And, here we are 45, 50 years later, and we're still stuck in that world. At least in some states in America, you see drug decriminalization. But here in this country, we're very much still in the world of the war on drugs with Richard Nixon. And it's deeply, deeply concerning. Imagine if alcohol was illegal, right? How many people would be if people were policed in such a way because they were using alcohol? What's the difference? What is the difference substantively? And I think Ash is absolutely right. At the very least, it's such a small, minor demand to decriminalize marijuana, right? To legalize it. It's so insignificant. It's such a common sense policy. But it's one of those things where you think, I wonder if Western politics, Western polities are now so incapable of actually solving problems, demographic aging, climate change, inequality, the housing crisis, because what neoliberalism does is it separates the category of politics, of democratic decision making, from the economic sphere, from the productive sphere. And I actually don't think Western politicians even think they're capable of changing these things anymore. In America, you're seeing it because you have a federal system, right? You have 50 states. Some states, it's happening very incrementally, decriminalizing it. We don't have that in this country. And I wonder how it can happen. Maybe we need an independent Scotland, which has, more progressive drug laws. Maybe that's what's going to have to happen, because I just do not see it in Britain right now. And when it's such a common sense policy, it would save money, save resources. It's more socially just. What's the argument against it? And that's what you won't ever hear. And yet we're not making any progress.
And just very, very quickly on the matter of the legalization of drugs, is that I think that, the legalization of cannabis, I think that's possible, it's plausible, but I'm actually advocating for the legalization of all psychoactive substances, and I'll tell you why. It's not because I think that necessarily you can use every single drug as safely as you can use another. Crack cocaine, heroin, obviously very different from, taking MDMA or, smoking cannabis, right? Different things involved, different levels of harm, different levels of risk. However, who does it help to criminalize some of these substances? So if you are a problematic user of heroin or of crack cocaine, is the fact that it's illegal going to help you in your recovery? Probably not. It's actually probably going to hinder your recovery, because it also means that you're more likely to be criminalized. If you commit crimes which are related to your addiction and you do time, it's going to be much harder for you to come out, seek stable employment, stable housing, and beat your addiction. So one of the things that I think we really need to hammer home is that drugs prohibition isn't actually making people safer. And we have a very good example of it in the UK. Scotland has got the worst drugs death rate in Europe, right? And it's not something we talk about in the UK. It's certainly not something we talk about in England, because we do tend to see, Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland as, these vassal states. And even, the most, liberal, tepid ideas like, safe usage rooms, safe injection rooms, they've not been taken up. And it's costing lives. It absolutely is costing lives. So it's not simply the case that, I believe in, the end to drugs prohibition from a perspective of freedom, a perspective of individual liberty, but I also think it would do so much more in terms of harm reduction and addressing some of the social ills caused by problematic usage and addiction.
Can I quickly come in, Michael?
Very quickly.
We need to treat this like a public health issue. And you've got people who are vulnerable. Often they've been economically disadvantaged. They may have suffered all kinds of stigma and prejudice, and they're suffering from an illness fundamentally. And what we do is the last thing we should be doing, which is putting them in a cycle of structural violence, which is what incarceration is. And we're not dealing with that problem. We're only actually intensifying it, making it worse. And I think that conversation around drugs legalization and carceral reform, something we talked about very often on the show, I think we'll be doing a lot more over the next couple of years. They go hand in hand, and they're really, I've not encountered strong arguments against this, which is what makes it so intriguing that actually we're not seeing progress here, because, we're not hearing the compelling arguments. There's no big financial interest, really. There's no big sort of pro-prison lobby in this country. So where's it coming from? I'm intrigued at this kind of inertia and ideological stasis that really comes out of small c conservative politics, both here and the US. I think more here, to be quite frank, which just thinks it's incapable of solving problems.
We're going to go on to our final story of the evening. Before that, that this organization is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Are restaurant owners working class? Are property developers in charge of £13 million developments working class? It might seem like a silly question. You might think, no, obviously these people are not. There is no rundown of the different classes that includes restaurant owners and property developers in the section called working class. But the Guardian's North of England editor disagrees. This became apparent when sort of people online really did a bit of digging into an article that was published this week in The Guardian. Let's take a look at this. Imagine the state we'd be in if Corbyn had been in charge. The view from the Red Wall. Working class voters in Lee do not regret voting for Tories after listening to Chancellor's summer statement. So sort of classic Guardian Corbyn bashing piece. But the question one has to ask after reading, what's this based on? Has a poll been done? Is there a survey? No, there are 4 people cited in the article. 2 are retired. 1 was still at school, and the only one currently working owned an artisan pizzeria. So this is the Guardian's image of the working class here. So let's go to a couple of quotes from the article. So this is character 1. In Lee Town Centre on Wednesday afternoon, Andrew Twentyman was on the phone sourcing Nuja sausage for his artisanal pizza parlour, recently reopened at under 50% capacity. A first-time Tory voter in December's general election, Sunak's hospitality package made him feel massively vindicated for switching his vote from Labour. Can you imagine what state we'd be in if Jeremy Corbyn had been in charge of all this? He asked. Now, well, I mean, can you imagine? Probably the government would have listened to the trade unions, and they would have stopped forcing people to go into work earlier. They probably would have, stopped people going onto full public transport, buses and trains, and we would have had less bus drivers passing away. I mean, I think probably it could have been a lot better if Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. But anyway, we'll listen to this guy who makes Nuja pizzas. Let's go to the other couple who are in this. So we're missing out the schoolgirl, and we're going to Keith and Jacqueline Park. So this is a section about Keith Park. He recently retired from the NHS, where he worked for years as an infectious disease nurse. He felt able to vote Tory only after burying his dad. He'd kill me. And he said he was primarily motivated by a desire to cut immigration in a borough that is 97% white. Whole sections of Lee that are colonised with new entrants, he said in March, claiming that when he used to do contact tracing for TB, almost all the new infections came from asylum seekers from Africa and the Middle East. Now, there are 2 obvious issues here, looking at those two quotes. Which is, one, is it okay to quote that claim about TB without a fact check? Obviously, there's a lot of dog whistles going on there. But also, why are these taken as representatives of working class voters? None of them have working class jobs. It's only 4 people. Can you really say the Lee working class are really glad they voted against Jeremy Corbyn because of these 4 interviews? The fact that this sensationalist conclusion was drawn from such a small sample looks even worse when you look at PID's previous piece on Lee's working class. Now let's pick up this piece from a month ago, where she interviewed again 4 Lee residents. 2 of the 4, pizza shop owner Andrew Twentyman and retired nurse Keith Park. So the Guardian just keep going back to this town, interviewing the same people and saying this is what the authentic working class of Lee think. And how did she find this unrepresentative sample? So you might think, if you're only going to get 4 people, at least make sure that you find them in a sort of robust way. Maybe you get a polling company in, someone who puts together focus groups, so you can pick people who are particularly representative of the different communities in the area. That doesn't seem to be what happened. Let's bring up this tweet, which people found on Twitter, from Helen Pidd. I just ate an excellent pizza in Lee, and you should too. Twentyman's, the place is called. So this is the North of England editor who's written a piece about what people in Lee think. She's going to the same 2 people for every article, and it's just someone who she bought pizza from. So you often get this thing in when you're watching commentators speak on television, where most of their opinions from ordinary people are from cabbies. And the reason this is because the only time these people meet ordinary people is when they're getting a cab from their home to the TV studio. Politicians do the same thing. Now what we get is Guardian journalists who get all of their opinions from restaurant owners when they get artisan pizzas, and now they claim that's the voice of the constituency. Guys, what do you make of this? Aaron, I know you've been incensed about this particular story today.
Well, we talk about client journalism in this country, but, I never thought client journalism would mean that you would write a guy into 2 of your stories from one town just because he gave you a free Quattro Stagioni pizza. That's not what I think of with client journalism. You can be a little bit more ambitious with that, I think, Helen. You're a northern editor at The Guardian. It's a big publication after all. By the way, if you go on Instagram, 20man, I think 20man Pizza XX, the pizzas look horrendous. They're all burnt. They're all burnt. The bases are different sizes. I'm thinking, this guy's a baker. My God, they're putting on he's just throwing ingredients on. This is not a pizza.
I always forget, Aaron, that you're half Italian, and then you show, a shoddy pizza with some, off-brand toppings, and suddenly this comes out, No,
it looks like somebody has pissed in a sponge, and they've put sriracha sauce on top. They've covered it in sriracha sauce. That's what it looks like. It's this thick, and it's covered in sort of red sauce. Anyway, and I'm thinking, like you say, is it a send up? Because it's pronounced Ndoya, by the way, Michael. Yeah, it's a kind of Ndoya. Oh. So it's a bit like a meat sausage spread, and it's delicious.
It's delicious.
And you think is this a send up? Is she taking the mickey out of herself? And then you've got this other guy saying about 97% Lee, it's 90% white rather, and we've got a problem with migrants, and they're spreading all these diseases. You think he's saying illegal immigrants from Africa? What countries, right? And how do you know they're illegal immigrants? I mean, I find it remarkable that a liberal journalist would just take all this crap at face value and you say, well, this is what they're saying. Yeah, maybe they're wrong. You have obviously to report what people are saying. You also have a responsibility as a journalist to aspire to the truth, right? It's not like you can interview somebody. Oh, what do people in Lee say about climate change? Oh, well, Mr. John X says that it's actually a fabricated lie by a London-based elite paedophile ring. Would you write that? No, because it's fucking stupid. It's mad. And this is mad too, Helen. So, I mean, it was one of the worst pieces of reporting journalism I've ever seen in my life. And it is concerning. I'll just finish with this. Helen Pidd is so obsessed with Jeremy Corbyn. She dressed up as him at a Halloween party. She dressed up as Jeremy Corbyn with big black eyes around. I think, I'm not interested in your strange vendetta. Right? I want you to tell me what people in Lee think about this scheme. People on universal credit in Lee have gone up 65% since this crisis began. Go talk to them. Go talk to the people who are actually furloughed staff, rather than the restaurant owner who now doesn't have to pay them for the duration of the crisis. That would make, if you want to talk to working class people, go talk to the staff, not to the boss. I mean, it really tells you there's something deeply wrong at a political level with senior people at The Guardian. If this is permissible, if this is normal, you know, I don't think this is just a one-off. I think there's a significant problem of political culture amongst the liberal political kind of class in this country. It's not that big, but you know, it's very powerful. It's far more influential and has a far more prominent profile than the socialist left. If your instinct is to interview the boss rather than the employees when you're talking about working class people, there's a big problem there.
And also, I mean, this might seem a little bit petty, but it is funny. People looked up reviews for this particular restaurant, and it doesn't seem like Andrew Twentyman is a working class hero. Let's get one of them up. So someone puts in there, one of the best pizzas I've ever had. So they think it's good, even though you think it looks shit, Aaron. But a little on the expensive side for Lee, but worth a visit, 4 stars. And now this is how Twentyman responds. Lewis, you get what you pay for. You have just reduced our average rating because you have an opinion about us being expensive. You didn't calculate in the costs involved in renovating the premises, quality of service. Our pizzas which you can dine in and eat use only the finest Italian ingredients, not from concentrates or powders, and cooked in a traditional wood-fired pizza oven, far cheaper than Domino's and only a fraction dearer than other takeaways. You can see why this guy doesn't sound like he was going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Like whatever the guy had to say about anything. Another reviewer, Dan Reynolds, gave the restaurants a 3-star review a year ago, to which Andrew replied, Dan, is this review because you didn't get a chef job or because I didn't ask for your lamb terrine recipe that Ben's your previous employer also rejected? This negative attitude towards your work and now as a small family run business is the reason I couldn't employ you.
3 stars. Oh my God.
So this is Keir Starmer, Andrew Twentyman. This is the man whose vote you need. We need to be scapegoating people who give 4 stars at restaurants just because it's slightly pricey. I think that's the dividing line that we need in this party between the people and, well, everyone else, I suppose, the bastards who give you 4 stars if you overcharge. So another thing people discovered about this person who Helen Pidd's put forward as sort of like the working class voice, tribune even of Lee. His brother, we can get this up from the Lee Journal, is a property developer in charge of a 13 million, my apologies, not billion, redevelopment in the centre of town. And in response to this, so Helen Pidd reads all of this sort of, dismantling of the article, and this is what she says. Let's get this up. For those alleged Labour supporters who have been trying to get ex-Labour voters in this story cancelled, shame on you. Why not try to understand why Lee went Tory and what it will take to win these folk back instead of piling on? The obvious question there is who was getting cancelled. I mean, they're just looking up reviews of the pizza. No one's writing to anyone's boss. This guy is his boss. You can't get the pensioners cancelled because they're retired. But anyway, I don't think anyone was trying to get anyone cancelled. This follow-up was what really got people going, though. From Helen Pidd, Northern editor at The Guardian. You can be working class and run a restaurant or indeed be a property developer. Ask Andrew Twentyman how much money he makes from the pizzeria. The minimum wage. The Guardian interviews universal credit claimants all the time. I'm sure I will do so in Lee before too long. I mean, you've been writing pieces about what Lee thinks for months now. Maybe you should have found someone who didn't own a pizza shop or was retired, who was at school before you started writing articles about what the working class of Lee think. The other thing is every business owner tells you they're on the minimum. This is how people do their tax returns. It's like this is the other thing of how out of touch these people are. Everyone knows that self-employed people always tell you they don't earn much money. That's how they do that's how you add up the sums. It's not quite tax avoid. It's like, but everyone knows it apart from Helen Pidd, Northern editor at The Guardian. Aaron, you look desperate to intervene.
Go on, I have many feelings about this. Like, one, the trying to get people cancelled. I loved it. I was just like 999. I'd like to report an attempted cancellation. Like, it's completely meaningless. But 2 is that it does speak to the completely arse backwards way we conceive of class in this country, which is completely abstracted from and distinct from discussions of wealth. And that's why we can have these kind of, strange kind of, cultural hang-ups about what does and what doesn't constitute a middle-class identity. So even though this guy is like running an artisanal pizza parlor and he's, you know, spreading, well, how do I pronounce it? Nduja. Okay. I have mangled that. I'm so sorry. But, you know, even though these are like traditional signifiers of bouginess, because he's got a regional accent and reactionary politics, it must mean he is authentic, salt of the earth, working class. However, if you're a Deliveroo rider and you're earning less than minimum wage and you're in debt and you can't pay your rent, but, you know, God help you, you live in Hackney, middle class, elitist, metropolitan, out of touch. You know, all these signifiers, they're both completely vapid, but they're also malleable, right? They can be attached to other things to serve particular political purposes. And I don't think that it's an accident. And I don't purely think it's, you know, it's not just the result of media idiocy that we have an idea of working class in this country, which is essentially small business owner, right? Who's, you know, likely on, you know, 50, 60K a year, right? That's what we think of as working class in this country. And it's all about how you position yourself vis-a-vis socially progressive politics. And it's a really good, it's ideologically useful for the right to go, this is the authentic working class, or this other lot are elitist. It means that you can use the language of minoritarian grievance to articulate dominant political interests. So you can say these are the people who are the real left behind, and they're not. They're homeowners, they're comfortable, the pensioners, you know, the small business owners. Whereas the working age working class, the majority of the working age working class, are sort of castigated and dismissed. And they have their political interests dismissed, you know, their voting behavior dismissed, because, oh, you know, you're just middle class lovies. And the irony, of course, that this is all being written up by middle class journalists. So it's not just idiocy. It's not an accident. It serves an ideological purpose.
I just want to say, you've said Helen Pidd is middle class, but she might dispute that, because as someone whose definition of working class seems to be has some reactionary opinions and a northern accent, she does have a northern accent, and it seems she has some reactionary opinions. Let's get a tweeter from 2015. A dismaying number of voters I met in Oldham today can't speak English despite living there a decade or more, but they're voting Labour.
How does she know they've lived there a decade or more if they can't speak English?
How does she know they're voting Labour?
Yeah.
I mean,
a decade
also,
or more. I'm going to tell you my life story. Oh yeah, you guys, what the fuck? That doesn't add up, Helen.
But also, you know what this stuff is. You know what this stuff is, right? Those dogs are barking in the background. It's this idea that Labour scams votes from immigrants who, you know, perhaps even participate in postal voter fraud, which is the whole rumour mill which went into overdrive after the Peterborough by-election result, right? It's classic dog whistle stuff, and it's about discrediting the political participation of people of colour. And it also, I'm sorry, like half the time when someone goes, oh yeah, that person doesn't speak English, it just means that they have an accent. A lot of the time, right? When someone says don't speak English, it just means I hear an accent and it makes it difficult for me to hear and understand this person, because every time I hear an accent, I just think, well, you're half a human being, aren't you? And one of the reasons why I bring this up and I'm so incensed is, do you remember when I was working at that pub when I first knew you two?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we'd have Novara meetings and I'd sneak you all free Peroni.
Yeah. I miss those days.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you got to get me back working at the Bluey. But I remember one night I was working at the pub and someone put a complaint in to my manager about the quality of my spoken English. They said, how dare you hire this barmaid who can't speak English? And I was just like, listen, you prick, I'm doing an English degree. But again, it's about how people react to signifiers of racial and cultural otherness, because that tweet doesn't make sense. How do you know they lived there a decade? How do you know that they're voting Labour if they don't speak English? Probably means that they have an accent. Maybe they're evasive or not as forthcoming as you would like because they don't want to talk to you. They're capable of speaking English. They just don't really want to talk to you.
They don't want to talk to Karen Pidd. All right, sorry. Also, can I just say one more thing? In regard to all of this, Ash has already sort of touched upon it. A majority of the working age population voted Labour in the last general election. A majority of renters voted Labour at the last general election. What does working class mean for these people? Working class is anybody who isn't a trade unionist, who isn't a renter, who isn't under 40, who has a university degree, who's from a minority background, or who potentially has a left-wing opinion, right? So basically you have about sort of 70% of the country is excluded from being working class. I mean, it's just
radicalized homeowners. Radicalized homeowners are the real working class.
Yeah. The left behind, the people who've paid off their £500,000 mortgages. How will they survive with this £500,000 asset? Come on. How will they get by? These poor people downtrodden by the political class for too long. And the thing is, a lot of these same people actually think that they're downtrodden. They honestly think they're the victims. It's crazy.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean by it. Like, it's a really interesting game. Have you been listening to the new season of Slow Burn about David Duke?
No.
It's really very good. And in I think it's like episode 2, David Duke talks about who his people are, right? The people he's targeting, and he calls them the forgotten majority. And it's all about that mood. It's about, the people who've got, a really clear stake in the economy as it is, who, are really powerful when it comes to deciding elections because of the geographic spread and also the fact of their, voter turnout. People who've done very well for themselves with or without a university degree, right? And that's the thing, is that often when people say, oh, working class, I mean, perhaps didn't go to university at a time where it was possible to still do very well economically without having gone to university, is that it's using the language of minoritarian grievance to inculcate the sense of a forgotten majority. I think it's one of those things which is very evocative. And when I heard it, I was like, ooh, that's unlocked a lot for me. So listen to that podcast. I know it's not one of ours, but you're allowed to listen.
Yeah, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to advertise competitors. We'll probably cut that out of the recording. Anyway, let's end it there. It's been a good Friday night show. Great having you on at the end of the week, Ash. We will, as ever, be back on Monday night for our next edition of Tysky Sour. Have a brilliant weekend. Please do donate to Novara Media. Go to novaramedia.com/support so we can continue to expand, continue to grow. Always like the video. It helps with the algorithm. You've been watching Tysky Sour. Good night.